And that editor said to me, without missing a step, he said, because it would be a death spiral for the journal. It would be a death spiral for the journal. What did he mean? He meant that if that his journal started to require clinical study reports, that the drug companies would take their commercially valuable studies to other journals to be published. And that journal would lose its impact factor. It would go down. It would lose its reprint sales, which is a significant source of revenue. And it would lose its advertising revenue from the drug company. So the journals know, they know that they are giving in to the commercial sponsors of the research, and they're protecting their own financial interests. I'm going to show you a slide about the market failure in medical knowledge as we get to the end. So you say, well, the good healthcare professional here is looking at the scientific evidence, and why doesn't he just read the journals and expect to see what's in those journals? Well, it turns out when the published articles, completed trials are published, and they're published in journals, only 23% of the important outcomes are reported in the journals. Only 19% of benefit outcomes are reported in the journals, and only 26% of harm outcomes. And go back to the Vioxx story, which is a long time ago, but the New England Journal failed to require that the Merck, who's the sponsor of that trial for Vioxx, they failed to require that Merck include certain very important adverse events that would have changed the whole view of Vioxx being a safer drug. It turned out it was a far more dangerous drug, that 1 out of 40 people who took it had a serious adverse event. It wasn't safer, it was more dangerous, and it was no better. But that wasn't included in the journal article. The FDA knew it wasn't included in the journal article. The FDA doesn't make journals correct articles when they know they misrepresent the scientific data. And the New England Journal wouldn't go back and correct it, and didn't correct it until a year after the drug had been pulled, and one of their editors was going to be shown in a videotape deposition, and this was going to be, they were at risk of being exposed for not presenting the important information, and they tried to get out ahead of it. So they wrote an expression of concern editorial. But the drug had already been pulled for a year, and already about 50,000 Americans had died from taking Vioxx, again, a drug that was no better than over-the-counter anti-inflammatory drugs. So how do the journals do this? How do the drug companies get these biased reports published? How do they create it? So this is litigation I was in. Kaiser Health System sued Pfizer for fraudulently marketing their drug Neurontin, gabapentin now. It's available as a generic. They sued them for fraud, and they sued them for racketeering activities. And this is information that I and other team members on the plaintiff's team found in the database of Pfizer's documents about how they set out to fool the doctors. So this is what happens. They're talking about aligning their marketing messages with the data, clinical trial data. And they say, this is the situation that we don't want to happen. I'm going to show you, there's another half to this slide. But if they have clinical trial data, and what they do is they formulate marketing messages, the key messages. And the key messages are not based on science. They're based on what has been focus group tested to appeal to doctors and make doctors likely to prescribe the medicine and make patients likely to want the medicine. So they develop those marketing messages as not as scientific evidence, but as sales evidence. And they take their marketing messages and they put it into slide kits that they can show to doctors, and they take it to CME courses to show to doctors, and they make advertising monographs, and that they create sales material. And then they do studies, and they take their study data and they put it in abstracts, and that gets turned into manuscripts. And lo and behold, the marketing messages produce monographs that are different than the manuscripts that are based on the study data in the ideal world. And this leads to inconsistent key messages, and that's not good for drug sales. So this medical communications company, Medical Arts Communications, showed Pfizer there was a solution to this problem. What they would do is not develop the marketing messages. They would not develop the marketing messages and the study data independently. What they would do is get their study data, put it through a filter of their marketing messages, and only what was consistent with their marketing messages would then come out into the abstracts, posters, and manuscripts, and into their marketing material and symposia and advertising monographs. And if you make the study data go through their marketing message, which are not scientifically determined, they're marketing determined, then you get key messages aligned. And then you can take the study data and it will promote your drug sales because it will support your key messages. Now, this was not just theoretic. Again, from litigation. This is draft 2 of an article from, you can see here, MAC is Medical Arts Communication, has been hired by Pfizer to create a review paper on neuropathic pain dosing with Neurontin on how doctors should do that. Now, Pfizer knew that its clinical trial data did not support the use of gabapentin or Neurontin for neuropathic pain. They knew that because the FDA, they took their data to the FDA to file for an additional indication for neuropathic pain, which would sell a whole lot of drug. That's the holy grail of pain medicine, is neuropathic pain. They took their studies to the FDA, and the FDA wouldn't even let them file an application. Their data was so weak. So Pfizer did the right thing, and they hired 3 consultants, and they brought the 3 consultants in. And again, as a consultant in litigation, I got to see all of these documents, that what really happened. They brought these 3 consultants in, they showed them the real data, and they said, what can we do to get FDA approval for Neurontin for neuropathic pain? And the answer of the 3 consultants was, you're done. The data doesn't support it. You can't do it. It's not right. It doesn't help. And I don't have time to go into the specifics of why doctors think that it helps, but it doesn't. And if somebody wants to ask a question about that, we can take a deeper dive into it. But here, Pfizer's hired Medical Arts Communication to help them write a review article that will show doctors what they know the FDA denies and their own consultants deny, to get doctors to prescribe Neurontin as a treatment for neuropathic pain. This is the second draft of Medical Arts Communications development of this, and they've got their key messages. And look at this. The manuscript is neuropathic pain dosing. The author is going to be Baconia, and Medical Arts Communication is in contact with Baconia, but he hasn't agreed to be the author yet. So the commercial ghostwriting outfit is in its second draft, and they haven't even gotten the author to agree to it. And what are their key messages? Gabapentin is an anticonvulsant that has proven effective in the treatment of neuropathic pain. The FDA said no, their studies said no, and their consultants said no. And they want to get the patients right up to 1,800 milligrams a day, which is the maximum FDA allowed dose. And they say gabapentin doses up to 3,600, twice the FDA allowed maximum, have been proven well tolerated and effective in clinical studies. And this article was published in a journal. This draft is from, I think, 2001. The article was published in 2003. So what's the real truth about new drugs? This is from the German Health Technology Assessment Agency, and it shows that out of 216 drugs, only 54 of 216 new drugs showed considerable or major improvement over previously available therapy. Only 1 out of 4 new drugs had a significant benefit. So you say, well, why don't doctors just learn what the 1 out of 4 drugs is and prescribe those and not prescribe the others? And the problem is that the United States does not have a health technology assessment agency. The other wealthy countries do. And they look at the data and they guide their doctors and they guide their insurance coverage based on the comparative efficacy of new drugs compared to the older therapies that are the standard therapies. But we don't have such a mechanism in the United States. We were the first country to have it. We had it in the 70s. But in Newt Gingrich's contract with America in 1995, they zero funded it. So the association between drug characteristics and manufacturing spending, this is an article was in JAMA in 2003, so it's just a few months old. And what this article found is that out of 135 new drugs, top-selling new drugs in the United States for which they could get data, 43 had high added clinical benefit, and more than twice as many, 92, had low added clinical benefit. So you might ask, well, how did the authors know that when you can't get that data in the United States? And the answer is they took the health technology assessment data from France and Canada and put it together and found that less than a third of the new drugs had high added value. But here's the problem. Drugs are so expensive in the United States and marketing is so open, Wild West, that the drug companies can spend whatever they want. So they spend 3 times more on their low added clinical benefit drugs than they do on their high added clinical benefit drugs. And the doctors have no way to sort this out. They don't know. So without a formal mechanism of health technology assessment, US doctors can't identify which one of the 4 drugs is truly better than previously available therapies. And because the prices are so high in the United States, 3.5 times more than the cost of brand name drugs in other OECD countries, the drug companies can spend so much on marketing that the new drugs diffuse out into public use much more quickly than in other countries. And the end result is between 2/3 and 3/4 of all drug profits, of global drug profits, come from the United States. So here's a question. I want you to write down your answer to this question. In 2008, a newly launched drug cost the median price of a year-long supply of a newly launched drug cost $2,115. I want you to take a pen and write down what you think that cost was in 2021. Take a guess, put it on paper. And now I will show you. I would like to hear your gasps, but I can't hear it. In 2021, the median annual cost of a new drug had gone from $2,000 to $180,000. That's how fast things are changing. And 2021 wasn't a quirk. In 2022, the price went up to $257,000. So now we get to the heart of the matter, because remember, this research is being done to maximize the return on investment to the investors who are funding this research and owning the stock. Jill Lepore is a professor of history at Harvard. She wrote a book called These Truths: A History of the United States. And she was talking about innovation, how the concept of innovation was brought in to the lexicon many years ago. And she says, innovation might make the world a better place. We assume when we hear the term biotech innovation, that is a priori, on the face, a social good, that innovation in biotech is a good thing. What Jill Lepore explains to us is that innovation might make the world a better place, or it might not. The point was, innovation was not concerned with goodness. It was concerned with novelty, speed, and profit. So innovation in the United States being the only country that doesn't control the price of drugs, so we give patents and we let drug companies own monopolies on their new drugs, but we don't control the price. So this innovation is being taken, just the sky's the limit. So here's why we don't see what's going on. We think of a market that sells what's called experience goods. This is the market that Adam Smith described in the 1770s, where consumers can go to the market and they can test and taste and compare the price, and they can agree to purchase drugs of an acceptable quality for a fair price. So there's a supply of the drug, and the butchers and the brewers and the bakers bring their stuff to the market, and the consumers come to the market and they can taste them and sample them and compare prices. There's symmetry of information and a negotiated price. And that's the way the market that Adam Smith described, that's going to optimally distribute goods and service to the benefit of all people in society. That's the way it works. The problem is that biotech products, biotech innovation, doesn't produce experience goods. It produces credence goods. With credence goods, consumers can't test the product. They can't determine the value of the product to them, and they can't compare the comparative price. They must depend on information from experts, and in the case of drugs and devices, those experts are the commercial companies that manufacture those products. They have the information. So it's not supply and demand, it's supply. Let me find my mouse. So it's not supply and demand being interactive. It's that the supply is determined by the information that's claimed by the manufacturer, who now, as we see, controls the studies, controls the write-up of the studies, controls the academic medical centers who do some of the research. And that information, not the actual qualities of the product, but that information creates the demand. So we've got complexity, which puts the consumers and the doctors in an underdog position in comparison to the manufacturers. Prices are not negotiated. This is singular in the United States, and it's craziness that we grant monopolies but don't negotiate prices. Insured consumers pay only a fraction of the cost, so price discipline doesn't work. And as we've talked about in the previous slides, there's asymmetry of information, there's non-transparency of clinical trial data, and there's lack of oversight of the integrity of medical knowledge through health technology assessment mechanisms. So now we turn to guidelines. And doctors are implored to practice guidelines, and guidelines can be produced in malpractice cases. So doctors really have to follow guidelines. In 1999, there was an article about guidelines that showed that only 43% of guidelines comply with the standards for guidelines. And in 2011, the Institute of Medicine went back and looked at this, and they found that certain factors were common in undermining the quality and trustworthiness of clinical practice guidelines. And two major ones were limitations in the systematic reviews upon which the guidelines are based, because the systematic reviews don't have access to the real data, and the experts who write those reviews don't have access to the real data. And despite all efforts, conflicts of interest have not been squeezed out of the clinical practice guidelines. So in 2011, the Institute of Medicine recommended that the National Guideline Clearinghouse post on its website, the trustworthiness of the clinical practice guidelines that it had on its website, so that the doctors could know whether the guidelines were following guidelines for guidelines. So soon, the National Guideline Clearinghouse became the go-to place, and they were getting, as we got into 2017, the National Guideline Clearinghouse was getting 200,000 hits a month with doctors and consumers looking at guidelines. And the IOM had made the recommendation that the National Clearinghouse add a comment about the trustworthiness of the guidelines. And this is from the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, and they said that they were going to implement the recommendation of the IOM in 2017. sorry, I lost my mouse, but you can see the bottom of this slide. Determining and posting assessments of the extent to which guidelines accepted for inclusion in the National Guideline Clearinghouse adhere to the IOM standards will begin in October 2017. And now if you look at the top of this slide, this was posted in 2018. The Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality National Guideline Clearinghouse website will not be available after July 16th, 2018. Why? Because federal funding through the AHRQ will no longer be available to support the National Guideline Clearinghouse as of that date. In other words, the AHRQ was doing an incredible service, excuse me, for doctors and patients to tell them how trustworthy each guideline was. And the AHRQ's reward for providing that information to doctors and consumers was to get zero funding, their funding taken away, and have the program canceled. So doctors don't have access to independent assessment of the integrity of the guidelines. So where are we? 86% of clinical trials are now commercially funded. 97% of the most frequently cited articles are commercially funded. Compared to non-industry sponsored studies, industry-sponsored trials have significantly more favorable efficacy results, harm results, and overall conclusions. And remember, we do not have health technology assessment, so doctors can't find out the extent to which the representations made in the articles are accurate. The majority of physicians' CME is funded by industry, and 59% of the authors, despite decades of saying that authors of clinical trial guidelines should not have financial ties to the companies whose products they're writing about in the guideline, 59% of authors of expert guidelines have financial ties to an interested manufacturer.